Anne Stuart had now lived through the reign of her father, James II, and her sister and brother-in-law, Mary II and William III. She had suffered through 17 pregnancies and lost all of her children, and her health was now so bad that she was crippled by her illnesses, unable to walk for long. And yet, for all this, Anne was now Queen of England and Scotland. When William III died, the mood of the nation was lukewarm. He hadn't been a popular monarch, although he had been the saviour of England once. He wasn't widely mourned. In fact, some people rejoiced at the fact they would now be ruled over by a monarch who wouldn't send money away to a foreign country or for foreign wars. Anne was immediately popular. After a fitting but subdued funeral for William at Westminster, with Prince George of Denmark as chief mourner, Anne wasted no time in raising those who had stood by her. The Earl of Marlborough was given the Order of the Garter and confirmed as Captain General of Anne's army. She appointed George as Lord High Admiral, giving him charge over her navy. But it was Sarah Churchill, the Countess of Marlborough, who received honours that had never been held by a woman before. As Anne's favourite lady-in-waiting, Sarah became the groom of the stool, mistress of the robes, and most importantly, keeper of the privy purse, making her responsible for the management of the royal household finances. Just a short while after becoming queen, Anne tried to raise the Marlboroughs to the rank of Duke and Duchess, but Sarah turned it down. This was because the rank of Duke socially came with the understanding that a lot of money had to be spent in upkeep and social occasions, and Sarah feared it would ruin them. To counteract this, Anne attempted to get Parliament to give £5,000 a year as a pension to the Marlboroughs, which shocked the High Tories with her blatant favouritism. The obvious opposition forced Anne to withdraw her request, and made Sarah more opposed to the Tories, who she viewed as little more than Jacobites. Tension started to grow between Anne and Sarah as the Countess of Marlborough tried to persuade the Queen to her way of thinking, trying to convince her the Tories were secret Jacobites. Anne was a moderate and balanced person at heart, and refused to be pulled into the belief of extremes in her government. She again put through her request for the £5,000 pension, this time including £2,000 from the privy purse, and this time the Marlboroughs accepted the offer of a dukedom, becoming the Duke and Duchess of Marlborough. The whole incident had dented Anne's confidence in Sarah's opinions, however. On the 11th of March, just 3 days after Anne was proclaimed Queen, she addressed Parliament for the first time. It was the first of many speeches she would make to the Commons, being present there far more than any monarch before or since. Anne started by stating her sadness for the death of William III and acknowledged she was extremely sensible of the weight and difficulty it brings upon me. She then added her belief in her kingdom's religion, the laws and liberties of England, maintaining the crown in a Protestant line, and upholding Parliament and its laws would encourage her in this undertaking. Anne then rounded this up with a sentence directly designed to compare her to the less popular reign of William, but used to assure those present she would look after England's best interests. As I know my heart to be entirely English. On St. George's Day, the 23rd of April 1702, Anne was crowned as Queen at Westminster Abbey. Plagued by her illnesses, she was unable to walk and had to be carried to her coronation in a sedan chair, cut low at the back to allow her robes to flow out behind her. There were many who were nervous of being ruled by a woman. Although Elizabeth I had ruled her country through a golden era, Many remembered her tempers and disagreements with her Privy Council over the huge achievements she made, and worried that a similar situation might occur with Anne. It was also thought, as a woman, she would be ill-equipped for the inevitable war with France which was coming. In such patriarchal times, it was assumed that men were the natural leaders and women were incapable as they were subject to their emotions. Thankfully, there were those who recognised Anne's coming reign as a ray of hope for her gender. A noblewoman named Dame Sarah Cowper noted in her diary that her husband agreed, for the first time, to have dinner at the time she wanted. Perhaps, happening in the reign of Queen Anne, 'tis a sign the power of women will increase, she noted. An early feminist, Mary Astle, believed that women would feel encouraged by one of their number being on the throne and would be inspired by Anne's example. As much as many had faith in her rule, others were unimpressed by the fact that not only was she a woman, but a disabled one at that. In the eyes of many, this meant Anne was never going to lead her troops into battle, but also that even if she commanded from the throne, it was still going to be the commands of her advisors. Few thought that Anne had the strength of personality required to actually rule in her own stead, and many others thought she would be the puppet of the Duke and Duchess of Marlborough. While it was true that she did, as someone with no personal military experience, look to others for good advice on winning a war against France, John Churchill also noted to Sidney Godolphin, 1st Earl of Godolphin and Anne's Lord High Treasurer, that he didn't like to do anything Anne would disagree with. There was discussion also that George should be named as king, but it turned out he was quite happy to continue on as he already was. When pressed about the issue, he retorted, "I am Her Majesty's subject and have sworn homage to her today. I will do only what she commands of me." His willingness to pass up the title of king meant that not only was it a boost for early feminism, but also that Anne was the first queen to be married to a consort who didn't hold the title of king. But all of this would pale in comparison to the true struggle of Anne's reign, that of the Whigs and the Tories. The Whigs wanted less power for the monarchy, more for Parliament, and they were hostile to France for this reason, as it was seen as the centre of absolutionism. They also therefore thought all Protestants should show a united front against Catholics, including Protestant dissenters. The Tories, by contrast, believed wholeheartedly in the inherited nature of monarchy and wanted Anne to hold absolute power. They didn't agree with the dissenters, who they saw as another form of the excesses of the Catholic Church and associated them with the chaos of the Civil War. Anne's early reign would be dominated by the Tories. As a high church Anglican Protestant and queen, she would naturally side with those who agreed on these terms. As a stroke of luck for Anne, the Whigs were a party divided on other matters, and backbench Whigs often voted with the Tories. With the help of Godolphin, the Duke of Marlborough, and the leader of the High Tories, her uncle Lawrence Hyde, Earl of Rochester, she managed to shape a government that was largely made up of Tories and moderate Whigs. They were also divided on the matters in Europe that England was swept up in. In 1700, Carlos II of Spain died childless, leaving a vacuum for his Spanish Empire. Philip of Anjou and Charles of Austria both had a claim to his throne, splitting Europe into France and Spain on one side against England, the Dutch Republic, and the Holy Roman Empire, which included Austria, on the other. William III had already started the war against France, and so Anne inherited this when she took the throne. One of her first acts was to surrender £100,000 of the £600,000 Parliament set aside as her income, stating it was to be returned to the government for the duration of the war. There is no evidence that this was anyone's idea but Anne's, and it raised her popularity, even though it made her own personal finances more difficult. However, it did also give her an excuse to not pay for an English household for her Hanoverian heir, Electress Sophia of Hanover. But even with Anne's extra contribution, the war saddled her with £14 million of debt when she inherited the throne, and it would end up at around £36.2 million by the end of her reign. This meant that getting Parliament to vote for the funds required became a delicate balancing act. In 1702, the Tories heavily promoted the Occasional Conformity Act, which was opposed by the Whigs. Anne gave her support to the act, which attempted to close a loophole which allowed dissenters to sit as MPs or vote in elections, provided they took communion once a year. Anne even made George vote for the bill, which he did reluctantly, as he was a Lutheran. This shows that despite George's personal beliefs or convictions, supporting his wife in her role as monarch was more important to him, and was a cornerstone of the close relationship between them. In February 1703, Sarah's world was shaken as her eldest son John, Lord Blandford, died. She began to excuse herself from court more and more after this point, spending time with her family and looking after the building of their family home. It was another bone of contention with Anne, who found the absences of her closest friend and advisor increasingly difficult to deal with in regards to courtly life. She wrote a letter to Sarah on the 22nd of May, stating that she, Sarah, John Churchill and Sidney Godolphin should remain as friends, and that Anne would remain their faithful servant. For the first time, Prince George was omitted, suggesting that Anne was beginning to view the Marlboroughs in a political context, rather than as personal friends. Sarah did continue to send Anne letters, including one from her husband, attempting to prove that the Tories held Jacobite sympathies. This only resulted in Anne attempting to break off her political correspondence with Sarah. This would only increase after 1704, after the Duke of Marlborough won a victory at the Battle of Blenheim, resulting in the Whigs growing in power within the government. Many of the high Tories were removed from their posts in Parliament, leading to these posts being filled by Whigs, including those from the most vigorous, known as the Whigs junto. Godolphin, Marlborough and Robert Harley, who was Speaker of the Commons and Secretary of State for the Northern Department, had to rely increasingly on support from the Whigs junto, made up of Lord Somers, Halifax, Orford, Wharton and Sunderland, who was a son-in-law of the Marlboroughs. Anne disliked all of them. As Sarah pressed the Queen to increase the number of Whigs in her government, Anne grew more and more irritated by her former favourite. Sarah, for her part, would shape this into her version of events, that she was nothing more than a faithful servant who was rejected for telling the truth. Anne sent Sarah an angry letter, saying that she was well aware of the intentions of both the Whigs and Tories, and that as she knew herself to be in the right, nothing would change her mind. Anne didn't bother to ask Sarah to change her mind on the issue, and it became obvious that she was no longer bothered about her once favourite. The Tories, for their part, had grown increasingly annoyed with Anne not agreeing with more of their policies, such as when she decided not to support the Occasional Conformity Act when it was put to the Commons again. She argued that she thought it had only been put through again to cause a quarrel, but to improve her relations with the High Tories, Harley came up with a scheme to increase her popularity, a financial plan to help the poorer clergy. Anne had a traditional income from the first fruits and tithes that came to around £17,000, and this would instead be surrendered to help supplement the poorest parishes in her kingdom. This did help balance things. Despite Anne's health deteriorating further, after 1704, this did not stop her from regularly attending cabinet meetings and meeting with her ministers. In fact, Anne would attend more cabinet meetings in her reign than any monarch before or since, even though her reign was characterised by a decrease in the crown's power and an increase in parliamentary power. But Anne's invalidity only increased the pressure to make a smooth transition on her death to the Hanoverian dynasty. While England, and by extension Wales, which was considered part of England, and Ireland, which was subordinate to the crown, had agreed to the Hanoverian succession, the Scottish Parliament had not. A vocal minority in Scotland wanted to retain the possibility of the Stuart dynasty after Anne, which would have meant a separate monarch on the Scottish throne, ending the union that Anne's family had brought since James I. Anne was very passionate that a union should remain, and English and Scottish representatives had met at the Cockpit, her former lodgings, to discuss the matter, but had broken up without a resolution in February of 1703. In 1704, Scotland responded by creating the Act of Security. This allowed them to choose the next Scottish monarch from the Protestants of the royal line of Scotland. This could not be the same person sat on the English throne unless England gave full trading rights to Scottish merchants. Anne had no choice but to give her assent to the act, as otherwise there was a danger Scotland would withdraw support for the war against France, or even become a base for French forces. In a go at tit for tat, the English Parliament responded by introducing the Alien Act 1705. This stated that if the Scottish went ahead with the plans outlined in the Act of Security, all Scottish people in England would be considered aliens, and sanctions would be placed on goods travelling into England. But there was a clause that this act would be revoked if Scotland entered into negotiations to join a union with England. Faced with economic ruin, Scotland had no choice but to agree to discussions, and Anne appointed commissioners to oversee the union in September of 1705. However, this was overshadowed by problems in the summer of the High Tories wanting to invite over to England the Electress Sophia of Hanover. Her son, later to be George I of Great Britain, was reluctant to take up the invite as he understood it would cause conflict, but equally he was unable to turn one down if it came. The Whigs rejected the motion to Anne's relief, but they managed to get through acts making the Hanoverians natural subjects of England, as well as providing for a regency council on Anne's death. Anne herself extended the Order of the Garter to Elector George and the Dukedom of Cambridge. This did, however, come with the stipulation that the war prevented him from visiting, but that she still wished to honour him. Clearly, Anne wanted to acknowledge he was her heir, but she didn't want them to come over. In 1706, the Marlboroughs once again pushed their luck, along with Godolphin, when they pushed the Queen to accept Lord Sunderland, the Marlboroughs' son-in-law and a junto Whig, as Harley's colleague, as Secretary of State for the Southern Department. Anne's connection with Sarah Churchill and her husband John grew weaker, and she turned increasingly to Harley for advice, as he was also worried about the Marlboroughs and Godolphins' leanings towards the Whigs. Anne began to turn her attention to a new favourite, Sarah Churchill's cousin, Abigail Hill. Abigail's father had whittled away the family's finances through bad investments, and so she was befriended by Sarah while she was still Anne's lady of the bedchamber. Sarah had taken Abigail into her own household, but by 1704 she was given a position in Anne's household instead. It wasn't long before she began to take Sarah's place as favourite. In her memoirs, Sarah would remark how Abigail schemed and plotted to take her place by Anne's side, whereas the truth is likely much simpler. The Queen had grown tired of Sarah's pushing and prodding about the Whigs, and her strong opinions, once so much of her charm, now irritated the Queen. Abigail, by contrast, had a quiet and gentle nature and didn't push about politics, and so was probably just what Anne needed as a contrast to Sarah. Equally, Sarah had been more absent from court over the years, and yet Abigail was very much present. She was also a firm Tory. The Articles of Union for England and Scotland's joining were agreed in 1706, and in January and March 1707 the English and Scottish Parliaments met and ratified them. The Acts of Union were set forward in 1707, and England and Scotland would now be joined into a single kingdom known as Great Britain, with a single parliament. A Thanksgiving service was held at St. Paul's Cathedral, which Anne attended. It was said that no one appeared more thankful than the Queen, who was satisfied that her kingdoms would now have peace as a single union, made stronger by being together. Later in 1707, Sarah found out that Abigail had secretly been married to Samuel Masham, a courtier in Anne's service, with the Queen's blessing. Anne had even contributed £2,000 to Abigail's dowry, but had not bothered to tell Sarah. When the Duchess of Marlborough found out, she was furious, and subsequently had an enormous argument with Anne, accusing her of appointing Robert Harley on Abigail's suggestion. Anne vehemently denied the appointment was anything but her own idea. Knowing she was being pushed out, Sarah then helped spread a poem around court accusing Anne of being in a lesbian affair with Abigail. No one paid it much attention, as it was clear Sarah was acting out of spite. Things came to a head in July 1708, when a Thanksgiving service was given at St. Paul's for the Duke of Marlborough's victory at the Battle of Oudenarde. Sarah had chosen some jewels for the Queen to wear, but Anne, quite pointedly, decided instead to wear a different necklace. This ended in the two women having an argument at the doors of the cathedral. Sarah also used the opportunity to show a letter from her husband about his hope Anne would use the victory for political ends, encouraging her again to take on more Whigs in her government. When Anne tried to continue the argument further, Sarah publicly told her to shut up, offending the Queen beyond measure. Afterwards, Anne wrote a letter in which she sarcastically referred back to the comment, explaining she would indeed be silent with Sarah now. She then asked John Churchill to keep the tension between his wife and herself secret, but he was unable to prevent Sarah being indiscreet. However, Sarah did actually apologise on this one occasion, realising she had gone too far, but her letter was ignored. But tragedy was to befall Anne yet again. Her husband, Prince George, had been ill since April 1706, coughing up mucus with blood. Mismanagement of the Admiralty, as George was Lord High Admiral, was laid firmly at his door. By October 1708, there were calls for his removal, but George was already dying in his bed. Suffering from edema and severe asthma, the Prince of Denmark passed away on the 28th of October at Kensington Palace. Anne, who had never left his side, was beyond devastated. A courtier reported that she continued to kiss him until his last breath as he lay dying, and it was almost impossible to drag her away from his body. Once again, though, Sarah Churchill made herself a nuisance. She dragged Anne away from George, convincing her to leave for St. James's Palace, something the Queen never forgave her for. Sarah then angered Anne further by removing a portrait of George from her bedroom and refusing to return it. It only caused another split in their relationship. Over the following year, Sarah argued with Anne about her relationship with Abigail, and on the 6th of April 1710, Anne and Sarah would meet for the last time. Sarah had been kept on in all of her positions purely to save face for John Churchill, who Anne still needed as Captain General. Nevertheless, Sarah was not as necessary as she thought. On meeting, Sarah demanded a reason for why their friendship was at an end, but Anne refused to engage, simply stating that anything Sarah had to say, she could put it in writing, and that Anne would give no answer to anything. The Duchess of Marlborough was actually reduced to tears, although whether this was from genuine grief at the loss of their friendship or her own loss of status is up for debate. Anne had already dismissed both Godolphin and Lord Sunderland, making it clear she had had enough of the small group leaning on her in ways they wanted, and her patience with them had run out. In January 1711, understanding he and his wife were about to be dismissed, the Duke of Marlborough came to beg Anne to allow them to keep their offices for another 9 months until the end of his current campaign. The Queen explained she was content to keep him at his post for now, but that Sarah was officially dismissed, and she wanted her to give up her golden key, Sarah's symbol of her office, within 2 days. Apparently, upon hearing this, Sarah gave her key to her husband and instead asked him to return it immediately. Her offices of Mistress of the Robes and Groom of the Stool were replaced by Elizabeth Seymour, Duchess of Somerset, another noblewoman who had become a close friend of the Queen. Keeper of the Privy Purse was handed to Abigail Massam, and Sarah was especially hurt by this, as she had proudly kept a close eye on the royal finances, and Abigail was definitely Anne's new favourite. The Duke of Marlborough went on to win his greatest campaign with the siege of Bouchain, and his victories meant that the Grand Alliance would likely have been able to march on Paris the following year, but it was not to be. Sick of war and wanting to stop the Treasury bleeding so much money, many in the government wanted to enter peace talks instead. During 1710, secret talks had been opened with France, along the lines that Philip of Anjou would remain on the Spanish throne, and that France and England would once again be at peace. The Whigs were against this, and while the Tories would prevail in the House of Commons, the House of Lords was another matter. In order to ensure a Tory win for the proposed Treaty of Utrecht, Harley needed more peers who would side with them. In an unprecedented move, Anne created no less than 12 new peers in a single go, something she wasn't entirely comfortable with, but also saw no other way to ensure the Whigs didn't win. The most controversial peer created was Abigail's husband Samuel Massam, who was made Baron. The tactic worked, however, and peace was at last brokered between England and France. This meant Anne no longer had any need for the Duke of Marlborough, and wanting a clean break, Harley was tasked with finding a way to be rid of him. John Churchill was brought upon trumped-up charges of corruption and dismissed. With no more state funding for Blenheim Palace, building ceased, and he was attacked by his enemies and in the press. The Duke and Duchess of Marlborough decided their best course of action was to retreat to Europe, where they were joyfully received by those Marlborough had fought alongside. They would never recover their relationship with the Queen, who showed no regrets for her decision, and they would not recover favour until George I took the British throne. Anne was now more alone than she had ever been, and yet she had finally moulded her cabinet and household to suit her needs better. But even after peace was brokered, due to Anne's refusal to allow Sophia to live in England, gossips whispered that she and her Tory ministers actually favoured her Catholic half-brother taking her throne. This wasn't helped by the actual intrigues of Harley and the Tory Secretary of State, Lord Bolingbroke, who really were in secret talks with James Francis by 1714. Anne was rapidly growing tired of Robert Harley as well. She was suspicious of his moves on many things, and others in her government also reported that he was losing his touch, exacerbated by losing one of his children and gambling losses. Abigail also fell out with Harley around this time, and she used her influence with Anne to encourage the Queen's growing dislike of Harley. Anne reportedly told her cabinet that he neglected all business, that he was seldom to be understood, that when he did explain himself, she could not depend upon the truth of what he said, that he never came to her at the time she appointed, that he often came drunk, and last, to crown all, he behaved himself towards her with ill manner, indecency, and disrespect. Certainly not someone who was in the Queen's good graces. On the 27th of July 1714, Anne dismissed Harley from his post as Lord Treasurer. Anne's health was failing her once again, and although she managed to attend 2 cabinet meetings to try and decide on Harley's successor, she was unable to attend a third. Anne had been seriously ill twice in the previous year, and it was becoming clear she was struggling more and more with her illnesses. On the 30th of July, the Queen suffered a stroke, which rendered her unable to speak beyond yes or no. On the advice of her Privy Council, the new Lord Treasurer was Charles Talbot, 1st Duke of Shrewsbury, a determined Whig, and one of the Immortal Seven who had signed the letter inviting William III to enter England's shores so long ago. At 7:30 in the morning of the 1st of August 1714, Queen Anne finally died. She was only 49 years old. One of her doctors, John Arbuthnot, summed it up very well when he wrote to Jonathan Swift about her death, saying, "I believe sleep was never more welcome to a weary traveller than death was to her." Anne was buried in Westminster Abbey by the side of her husband and children. As Electress Sophia had passed away 2 months before Anne, it was her son George of Hanover who came to Britain to claim his throne. He would become George I of Great Britain and started the Hanoverian dynasty in Britain, which would last until 1901. Anne's legacy has often been very neglected. Coming to power for only 12 years and her character being decimated by Sarah Churchill in her memoirs meant that for a long time opinions of Anne varied from being a shy, quiet puppet in the hands of her favourites to being nonchalant about government. In fact, her short reign was a starting point of the stability of the 18th century for Britain, and the reality from other sources, such as that of another of Anne's friends, Francis Apsley, is that Anne took the dominant role in all of her relationships. That certainly fits better with what is known of Anne as a strong-minded, stubborn woman with fixed principles. Queen Anne also never wavered from what she believed to be best for her nation. She was always a high church Anglican, she was always Tory, and she always believed heart and soul in the union of Great Britain. Far from being a weak leader with a petticoat government, Queen Anne was a firm and solid monarch who steered her country through war into peace, and was so certain of her own dynastic claims and religious convictions that she was willing to revolt against her own family for the good of the kingdom on more than one occasion. Anne was never meant to lead the throne, and when she did, she was both female and an invalid, in a position as a constitutional monarch when the kingdom was still figuring out what that actually meant. She was at the centre of her government, never out of the loop, always constant in visiting her cabinet, and all politicians felt they had to take into account her likes and dislikes and earn her approval. At the same time, Anne understood she could not push the limits of statute or parliamentary power, while equally seeing her closest ministers as her personal choice. And she was a devoted wife to her husband George, who was equally as devoted to her. In short, they were as close to an equal team as a royal married couple could be at the time. If any forgotten monarch deserves to be remembered, it is Queen Anne, who should be reborn in memory as the cornerstone of her reign. She preserved the Protestant religion she loved. She brought peace and stability to her kingdom, unified England and Scotland. She wasn't afraid to stand up to and control the important men in her government, and Anne also overcame the doubts of an ill, childless woman holding the throne successfully. Queen Anne was perhaps the greatest monarch of the Stuart dynasty, although she was the last, for ushering in a period of peace and strength for which she has been largely forgotten.